Chapter 2 of Tractate Bechoros begins the laws of the firstborn animal tithes. The first Mishnah says, if somebody buys a firstborn fetus of a non-Jewish man's cow, or he sells his own cow's firstborn fetus to a non-Jewish man, or somebody enters a partnership with a non-Jewish man to own a cow, or there's somebody who takes care of a non-Jewish man's cow, or somebody has a non-Jewish man take care of his cow, in all of these cases there's an exemption from the firstborn animal tithe, as the verse states, all firstborn in Israel. Kohanim and Leviim are obligated to give the Bechor firstborn animal tithe, as they're only exempt from the firstborn donkey tithe and the firstborn son redemption. The Gemara says the reason chapter 1 discussed the firstborn donkey tithe and chapter 2 discusses the firstborn animal tithe is as the firstborn donkey is special. As was mentioned in the prior chapter, it was made to commemorate the fact that the Jewish people left Egypt and brought their valuables out on donkeys. Or it's as it just involves a non-kosher animal, so it has much simpler laws. Regarding the purchase of such an animal from a non-Jewish person, the sale doesn't accord by our laws of acquisition, meaning the animal is transferred the second money is given, without need for an actual act of acquisition. That's sourced and additionally defined. This is different than the sale between two Jewish men, where it's finalized through a physical acquisition of the item, which it brings some verses on. The sources for this are largely based on a dispute between differing opinions as to whether it's forbidden to steal from everybody or only from Jewish people, although it is universally agreed later on that the prohibition against stealing applies to stealing from anybody, regardless of religion. Anyways, there is a specific case brought where there was a sale between a Jewish man and a non-Jewish man, and the sale only went into effect after a physical act of acquisition was made. So there are a few answers. It initially suggested that it was just that the non-Jewish man was making the sale in the manner of the Jewish people, although it concludes the actual context of the case was very unique, and that it was just a sale made in error, although there's differing opinions on the particularities of this case. New Mishnah. All consecrated animals that have a permanent blemish before they're consecrated and were redeemed towards money instead, they still have the firstborn tithe and the animal gift part tithes apply. Although as they were redeemed onto money, they're still unconsecrated to the point that they can be shorn, they could be used for work, and their offspring and milk could be used. They can inviolably be slaughtered outside the temple courtyard, they cannot be substituted, and if they died before they were redeemed onto money, they could still be redeemed. The exceptions to this are the Bechor and the Ma'aser offerings, which if they're blemished before consecration, they're still fully consecrated, as their consecration uniquely takes place from birth. If an animal's consecration went before the blemish, or it was a temporary blemish before the consecration that developed into a full blemish, which were then redeemed, they are not subject to the Bechor tithe or these listed animal part gifts. They don't become unconsecrated, meaning they can't be shorn or worked with, and their offspring and milk are prohibited, and there's liability for slaughtering them outside the temple. They can be substituted, and if they died before being redeemed, they must be buried. By the way, this Mishnah was entirely quoted in chapter 10 of Tractate Chulin. It's just repeated here as it's relevant to the Bechor offerings. The Gemara says, evidently this means that the opinion holds that monetary sanctity is sufficient to remove an animal from the firstborn tithe and gift requirements. We said in the first case, if the animals are redeemed, they can be shorn and worked with. According to some, this means that if offerings are not redeemed, they cannot be shorn or worked with, although others dispute this, saying such a prohibition wouldn't apply to offerings consecrated for temple upkeep. It would only apply to these animals of monetary sanctity, which are very similar to animals with physical sanctity. We said the offspring of these animals and their milk are permitted after the redemption. It's proven that the offspring can be redeemed even when they're blemished. This is as the offspring shouldn't be treated stricter than their mother itself, which is itself blemished. This implies that if somebody directly consecrated an unblemished ram for monetary sanctity, it would receive physical sanctity. Further, on the animals that were blemished before being consecrated, there's some dispute if we're talking about the temple altar or a private outside altar. It sources this, and also the fact that they would not be subject to substitution. We ended by saying if such an animal dies, it could be redeemed. It cites the individuals who held this opinion, and also a differing opinion that said if it dies, it must be buried. If the blemish occurred after consecration and they're then redeemed, we said they're not subject to the Bechor tithe or the Kohanic gifts. This is then sourced as this particular case is compared in scripture to a deer offering, which that would also be disqualified in a similar manner. It additionally discusses verses on this. It said by offerings that are consecrated and then blemished, that they don't become unconsecrated to be allowed to be shorn or worked with. This is then sourced when we said that their offspring and milk are prohibited even after redemption. This must be where they were conceived before the redemption and then born afterwards. If they were born before the mother's redemption, they would still be consecrated, which is sourced. As for what's actually done with these offerings that were conceived before and born after the redemption, it's a dispute if they could be brought onto the altar or if they must just be left to graze until they develop a blemish. Some suggest that right before the mother is redeemed, the offspring should be designated for that type of offering to resolve this. Specifically, they must be designated for the same type of offering as their mother and no other type of offering, which is source. The reason typically such offspring can't be benefited from is that this was rabbinically instituted to prevent people from raising flocks of blemished offerings. It explains the remaining points why such an offering can't be substituted, as its level of sanctity isn't strong enough, which it further sources. New Mishnah. If somebody enters a particular type of financial partnership with a non-Jewish person, called a Tzon Barzel agreement, over an animal, the offspring of the animal is exempt from the Bechor tithe, but the offspring of their offspring are obligated. If the offspring was stipulated as part of the arrangement also, the offspring of their offspring would be exempt, but those animals' offspring, the fourth generation, would require the Bechor tithe. Others disagree and say that all future generations of the animal are exempt, as the non-Jewish man has some ownership over all of them. New topic. If a ewe gave birth to an animal that looks like a goat, or a goat gave birth to an animal that looks like a ewe, it's exempt from the Bechor tithe. If it still has some of its mother's characteristics, it would have the tithe apply. The Gemara explains, by this financial partnership, the offspring of the animal uniquely is partially owned by the non-Jewish man, unlike by typical cases of such a partnership. As if the non-Jewish man decides to demand his funds, he could instead take the animal's offspring, so for this reason, those uniquely have no Bechor tithe applied to them either. We said the children of the animal are exempt from the Bechor tithe, but not the grandchildren. There's a differing opinion that the grandchildren are also exempt, but not the great-grandchildren, and it would actually maintain this view even if the second-generation animals were shared in the ownership. Instead, unlike by the Mishnah's opinion that the offering exemptions all just shift by one place. It additionally disputes between these opinions. We said a ewe that bears an animal that looks like a goat, it's exempt from the firstborn Bechor tithe. A related case was stated, if a ewe gives birth to a goat, it's a dispute if it's obligated or exempt. Issue is, when this was quoted, we're not really sure what it was talking about, so it disputes if this is referring to what we're saying, the Bechor tithe. There's some variation on what the case is discussing and some related points by other types of offerings. Also, by a sheep that was given birth to by a goat, it's agreed that there's no liability for mixing linen and its wool. It cannot be used for tzitzis. Its wool does not acquire impurity through leprosy, and similar principles apply by plants. If a fig tree is used as a support for a grapevine, then its wine cannot be used for libations, as its aroma has changed. New Mishnah. If a ewe simultaneously gives birth to two male lambs, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says both are given to the Kohanim. The sages say it's impossible to be so precise, so only one is given to the Kohen. Some say the Kohen would get to pick the better lamb, others say the owner gets to keep the better lamb. The second lamb would be left to graze until it develops a blemish, and it could then be eaten by the owner. There's a dispute if the owner must give the Kohanic gifts from this lamb. If one of the lambs died, it's a dispute. Some say they divide the remainder. Others say the Kohen can't prove it was his lamb, so he just gets nothing. If the two lambs that were born simultaneously are male and female, the Kohen gets nothing. The Gemara says, it's a dispute if things could be precise and things that are in God's hands, but as for things that humans do, it argues regarding a bunch of services in the temple or laws of impurity, as if people are capable of doing things in an extremely precise manner. That's disputed from another case, also including the measurements by the Egla Arufa ceremony, as discussed way back at the end of Tractate Sota. As we see in that discussion, the presumption are that measurements are inexact, so we see that it's held that measurements cannot be presumed to be precise. By the two lambs, the reason some held that the better lamb goes to the Kohen is as we assume the better lamb just went out first. The other opinion simply said that the owner retained the better animal. The reason some said that the Kohanic gifts must be given is either the animal is the Kohen's, as it was born first, or it's not the Kohen's, in which case the gifts would be still given anyways. The opinion which says they're not given is as he holds the Bechoros is considered as if it was sold by the Kohen, so the Kohanic gifts would be exempt in that case. Some say that by a Bechor of a doubtful status, that must have the Kohanic gift portions given, even according to this latter opinion, that it wouldn't typically be given by this regular case, even though there was no exchange of the Bechor in the first place. This is qualified. And it's also said by a Ma'aser tithe animal of doubtful status, there's an exemption from the Kohanic gifts, in spite of the fact that by the Bechor case, the Kohen could argue that either way he's getting the animal parts, as mentioned. The opinion which said that if one lamb dies, the remaining animal is split, actually retracted his earlier opinion that we assumed the firstborn was the healthier one, and it said some similarly comparable cases for the remaining points. New Mishnah. If two ewes give birth to two firstborn lambs, both are given to the Kohen. If there was a male and a female, the male is given to the Kohen. If there were two males and a female, one male goes to the owner and one goes to the Kohen. It's a dispute again who gets the better one. The other must be left to graze until it blemishes, and as mentioned, there's also a debate as to if the remainder is obligated with the Kohanic gifts. If one of them dies, it's disputed if it's split or if the Kohen gets neither. If the ewe had two females and a male, or two males and two females, the Kohen gets nothing, as we're unsure of the order of birth. If one ewe had already given birth and they have two males, one goes to the Kohen. Again, all of the disputes as mentioned apply here, who gets the better one, if the Kohanic gifts are given, and if one of them dies, again, it's disputed if they divide the remainder or if the Kohen gets nothing. Lastly, if these ewes give birth to a male and a female, the Kohen gets nothing. The Gemara says, all of these principles were largely stated in prior Mishnahs to show that the same principles apply even if there were 2 lambs that gave birth, or 2 lambs where one had already given birth before, that everybody still maintains their differing opinions. New Mishnah, if a firstborn animal is born by a C-section and a second animal is born normally, right afterwards, some say they both must be left to graze until they develop a blemish and then can be used, and others disagree and say the C-section is invalid as it was born by a C-section, so it's not considered a firstborn, and the second animal just isn't a firstborn, so neither of them is a Bechor. The Gemara explains, the dispute here essentially revolves around whether an animal that is considered to be a firstborn in only one aspect, if that's considered to be a firstborn, as some teach that it must be a firstborn in every single possible respect. This point is disputed from verses and between several opinions. And that's the end of chapter 2.